Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's Intermodal Safety Committee Building Blocks of Safety webinar. We're very pleased to present this today, and I would like to start by thanking Jason Hunt and Bert Mayo. Jason is the chair of IANA's Intermodal Safety Committee, and he is currently the general manager of corporate safety at the Georgia Ports Authority. And Bert Mayo is the vice chair of the Intermodal Safety Committee, and he is the Vice President of Risk Solutions at True North Companies. So thank you both, gentlemen, very much for working on this webinar today and making it happen. I think we are good to go, and I'm going to introduce Bert, who will introduce today's speaker. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And I'm not going to take much time. I do want to take a second, though, and introduce Dr. Gina Anderson. I've had the pleasure of knowing Dr. Anderson now for 2 or 3 years. I met her in our pursuit of trying to find a good LMS, learning management system. She's the CEO of Luma Brighter Learning. They're an award-winning LMS platform. They also won the 2023 award from Inc. 5000's fastest growing companies. So that says a lot about what they're doing in the industry. What I like about her focus and her personal passion is that she is truly focused on how to help companies figure out how to better teach adults, which is what we all work with. I frequently tell people that she is an expert in adult learning, which is what we need in our industry and all industries, actually. She's written many, many papers. She's got a podcast going on. I Love Learning podcasts, which is fascinating if you get a chance to tune into. She's written a paper that one of my favorites is Teaching Without Teaching Degrees. Gina's all things adult learning, and I'm proud to have her here. So without further ado, Gina, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Bert, and everyone on the call for joining and your interest in learning and being here with us today. I appreciate immensely the opportunity to share learning with you all and how adults learn. As Bert said, I have spent over 2 decades. This is my personal passion. I started my career as a special education teacher. And I always had this interest in trying to understand when people have learning hurdles, why do we have these hurdles? So I really studied the brain and really looked at, how our brains are made up in terms of how we process information and how we can not only help people retain information, but on the second situated part of that is really help change behaviors. There's 2 different mindsets. One is really getting people to understand content, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. And then the second piece of that is once they understand a concept and then they don't do the behavior, how we then can change behaviors and use motivational theories to do that. So I'm really going to focus on the former part where we really look at how do our brains work and how do we, if we understand that, how we can design programs to leverage that so that we can create a safer workforce. And that's what I'm going to present today. One of the things that I really want to start off and talk through, and really this has come to these terms that you see on the screen are terms that have been used for many, many decades. But really, I just wrote a thought leadership paper on this because artificial intelligence is really raising the urgency for us to define these 4 words because they really have an impact on human behavior. And once we understand the difference between each of these, we're able to come to the realization that content alone does not change performance. The words learning and education and training and content really are often used interchangeably, but they're not synonymous. They don't mean the same thing. But I see this all the time with these words. We use them and we don't really understand the implication of that and how that helps you not only select maybe the right vendor or the right program to help you, but allows you to situate your programs in a way that can help adults learn. So I'm going to start with learning because Luma, my company that I'm with, we're a learning company. Learning really changes human behavior or performance. So learning isn't situational, meaning it's lifelong and it's ongoing. And through my career of studying learning, it's really about understanding how people process information. And there can be barriers to information processing, which I'm not going to focus on today. But it's all about understanding how we acquire knowledge and then how we ground that into adult learning theory to create these other things that you see next to it. Understanding the learning science, then being able to create education training, and then how you design content. So learning itself, it crosses a lot of different industries. So part of my study was in biology. I looked at physiology, computer science, education, and really how our brain mechanisms work so that we can obviously help people remember information and change behaviors. Because for me, my personal passion is to help people become safer and better at what they're doing, because those things ultimately lead to more productive and happier lives. And honestly, even coming home alive, right? Because in our industry, your industry, what we're all working towards is having adults come home to their families. Because in this industry, safety, if they don't remember or they're not engaged in the learning, could mean life or death. And it's real. And we've all, seen that. So for me, learning is important. It's foundational to these other terms. So when you talk about designing learning, then a lot of times all of us that are on this call have gone through formal education. So education, really what it does is it helps humans see the world through a particular lens or light. So it helps us view the world from a perspective. So depending on that perspective and who's providing that perspective, it's going to ground our individual thinking in a certain way. So education programs, you can think of programs, you can think of, and I know this is one that you've heard before that has been taught to you. You think of like sexual education programs. Those are educational programs that provide a perspective on a topic. Usually education programs are preset, so they're defined and bound by objectives and goals, and really they should be grounded in. So you could have an education program, and hopefully who's designing your education programs have a background in learning science and understand the human brain and how we learn. Otherwise, that program could just be dissemination of content and not anchored in how to change human behavior. That third pillar there that you see there with squiggles is training. So training, if somebody is saying they're training is a short-term result of wanting to complete a specific task. It's very short-term. You're going to train on a short-term specific goal. And once they accomplish that, it's done. It's very repetitive because repetition can help ground and anchor specific things to your long-term memory. And we're going to talk about that. But it's very short term. So when you talk about sexual education training, that's not what you're doing, right? It's not a one-time thing. It's not what you would want to engage in. It's education. So we look at these different elements so that you can understand what you're not only talking about, but really what the focus is for that learning that you're wanting to do. The last thing, the reason why I'm very passionate about this is because there's a lot of people out there generating content. Content, when people say, Gina, what videos do you have? That's not what a program is. That's a medium that you can use. And there's certain ways of doing different types of content to anchor so that you remember that information. Content providers are a dime a dozen. And I think what you're going to find is that these are even going to become, with so much content and AI being able to generate content, we really have to look at not only who's providing that content and where it's coming from. AI is artificial intelligence, we actually use it at Luma. It's not a bad thing. It's just a matter of understanding how you can situate and use that to be able to build a program that adults remember the content. So it's really important to know that content providers will fuel and provide a resource or a medium that you can use, but that alone is not going to change behaviors. You have to have a comprehensive learning education program to change and situate content so that a person is able to recall it when they need it. And we're really talking about adult learning. And so a lot of what I'm going to go over today is going to focus on how our brains work. So you have an understanding of the human brain, and then how that's important to understand. And those elements are important to understand so that you can then begin to build an education program. And perhaps your education program does have some specific training in it. And maybe most definitely you're going to have content in it, but I could do a presentation on each of those individual pillars to help you design each in a way that's grounded to human cognition. It's so important because otherwise you're spending time, you're spending resources, and you're spending money on content that doesn't align with how people learn, or training that doesn't align with how people learn. So I'm very passionate about it because I see so much about education programs that are built that aren't actually grounded on human cognition. And so that's one of the main reasons why I'm in this industry, because I feel that there's such an opportunity to help adults so that they're able to, again, remember the content and change their behavior. The first thing that I always say with adults, you all had a choice. You were sent out this webinar, and I think there were close to 50, and it looks like maybe there's 20. So people had a choice on how they learn this webinar. And I want you to think about this, because a lot of times people say to me, well, Gina, we only have so much time. How are we going to provide all this choice? This program that you're in today actually did provide some learner choice. The choice is you could attend live and ask me questions and be here and engage with me, or there's going to be a recording of this and you could access this later on your own time, and perhaps send me an email or call me later. But there is some adult choice. Adults, all of us that are on this call, appreciate having a choice in how we learn. And so when we talk about designing programs, you can think about these 5 elements here on how you could provide your adults some choice in the way they learn. The questions I always ask are, what choices are you providing? Are all learners learning in the same way, same place, and same content? This is the way education and everyone, when I wrote the book, Teaching Without a Teaching Degree, I felt like most of us that didn't go through formal learning science, many of us, training and know how we learn, are going to teach programs the way we were taught, in a classroom, passively learning, all at the same time and same way. One thing that I am super uber excited about is that for once, with the new technology that we have with artificial intelligence and the ability to bring in content and situate learning, for the first time in education, while we've talked about differentiated learning, we're going to have the capacity to deliver content to different learners in different ways, just with the technology we have. So before we had the technology, there's still different ways that you can provide learner choice. And the first is the location where people learn. So right now we are all learning at the same time, but we're all learning all over. Bert's in Louisiana right now. I'm actually traveling. I'm in Iowa. We're all located somewhere different. We don't all have to be in a physical class together. We're actually in a virtual class. So Nugget, our mascot, would be over there by a virtual class. When can we learn? So some of you, everyone that's attending here now, everyone is doing it at the same time. However, there are going to be people that can learn afterwards, or maybe you want to go back and review something I say, and you're given a link and you can go back and review it. So having the ability to learn in different places and different times really aligns with our learning preferences. Our brains aren't the same. We don't process information the same way. And some learners have limitations where they need learner choice to be able to even process information. So if all of your programs are done in the same way, same time, everybody in the same content format, you're going to be losing some of those learners. And so this is why learner choice is critical to any program that you design. I consult and talk a lot to different individuals about, Gina, this just seems like so much. And you just pick one thing, even if it's one thing. How do they learn? Right now, you're all passively watching and listening to me. I can tell you that within 1/4 of a second, your mind started to wander. Our brains aren't situated to learn in these very concentrated ways unless you have an intrinsic motivation to want to learn this information. Your mind will start to wander. So there's different things. When I do this live, I have a bingo game and I activate your neurons by engaging you into the bingo game. And the reason I do that is because you want to activate your neurons so that you can even begin to learn. So active thinking and doing. There has to be a combination of how you're delivering content, because if this is the only time that you're going to hear this, you're not going to remember it. I can guarantee that, because our brains cannot take in this much information and remember what I'm saying. So how is very important. What are you doing? When I came into the transportation industry, everything I saw was videos. Videos aren't inherently bad for learning, but there is a specific way to do videos to help with human cognition. I wrote a paper on it. I'm happy to share it. It's very important that if you build this type of content, that you're doing it in a way that's situated with adult learning. There's all sorts of ways of doing the content generation. Like I said, with artificial intelligence, we can generate a ton of content, but how are we going to bring in that human component that anchors it to our ability to retain it? So if you're doing one thing, it's very important that you're doing multiple types of things to help ground that information. And then who's doing the learning? Right now we have a person delivering the content. Do you present the learning in multiple ways? Maybe the computer presents the information. There's a combination of who's doing it. And that's important because as adults, you think about it, you take your phone, it's within the first 3 minutes of waking up, most people grab their phone and they're scrolling through and learning and looking from the computer. There's a lot of behavior, different designs and methodology that talks and speaks to that in terms of the positives and negatives. However, the idea of human cognition and remembering is providing that in a lot of different ways by a lot of different facets. So whether it's the person or the computer, give the learner the choice. Maybe they want to learn on their phone and the iPads, and maybe somebody else wants to learn with a human instructor. And so providing that opportunity is critical for adults. So what's the first step in the learning process? This is if I were doing this and you could chat, I would have you tell me what is the first step in the learning process. But the very first step is senses. So those are my 2 dogs. They're looking out the window. Our eyes do this. So the very first thing to get is to get your attention. You have to have someone's attention for them to learn. This is the way that it wakes up your neurons, and it says, your brain says, hey, you pay attention to this. This is important. So it's the first step is to get somebody's attention. So if you don't have somebody's attention, then they're not going to learn. As exciting as you are, you could dance around, you could, be funny, tell jokes. Your mind is going to start to wander. And I'm going to actually show you that. Our working memory, I broke the brain up just in very simplistic terms. The working memory is where the information is stored. That's towards the front of your brain. So as you bring in information from your senses, That's where it is. That line in the back half of our brain, that's what happens, and it's stored in our long-term memory over a long period of time. That's the goal. We want the information because look, if you're in a critical event, if your vehicle is on fire, whatever it is, you have to be able to know in that moment when your neurons are distressed, you have to be able to recall that content. It's a matter of life or death. You have to be able to do that. So these strategies, this theory is real. And that's why, for me, I'm so passionate about it, because when you implement it, it works. It actually improves safety because you're aligning how you design your educational programs based in learning science. So this is what is involved in sensory input. So you could use sight, you can use sound, you can use touch, you can use smell, you can use taste. Most people use sound. They talk like me, talk, 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 talk. You know, whatever methodology you're using to get somebody's attention, that's the first thing to get somebody to learn. So what happens is, if information comes in, it only stays in your sensory memory, which is the forefront of your memory systems, for a fourth to a half a second. Then it's forgotten. So when the input comes in, it's either forgotten or I have your attention. If I have your attention, I have to keep it. So I'm gonna do a little demonstration, and what I want you to do, since you're not in the chat or in the Q&A, I want you not to write down, but I would invite you to participate in this so you can see, you can experience how information stays in our sensory memory and goes into our working memory. I'm going to show you a few things, and what happens is that everyone's mind starts to wander. And one of the things that we've been studying in the learning science field is how that's shrinking. The time before your mind starts to wander is rapidly shrinking. And they're associating this with kind of the YouTube generation and the Twitter generation and the Instagram, where everything is so fast and you're going through the information so fast that our brains are adapting and wanting that more and more. So what does that do for us when we're designing a learning program? Is the humans and the adults sitting in that room were probably on their Instagram even earlier, and their minds are wandering. They're thinking about other things. So I'm going to walk you through this activity. And what I want you to do, I'm going to give you 8.5 seconds. That's the time frame I'm going to give you to try to remember, without writing anything down, what is in this picture, and see if you can remember, see how much you can remember in 8.5 seconds. That was 8.5 seconds. So you looked at something for 8.5 seconds. So what your brain is doing right now is it's in your working memory. For 5 to 20 seconds that I'm talking, that's going to be in there. And you might be able, if I were to ask you to put in the Q&A, how many of you could rename 7 things, 7 plus or minus 2 things? And then if we were live, I would have you see who actually could remember 7 plus or minus 2 things. So think about it. It's been about 5 to 20 seconds. Some of you might be able to recall 5 or 6, maybe 7 things. So what is happening is our brains are working. It's in your working memory, and it's either forgotten or you're going to have to rehearse it. So the information has to be shown again to be able to even begin to be encoded into our long-term memory. So I like to talk about this because I think of this idea of like cargo securement. I went out and I was observing cargo securement, and I asked a fleet, I said, well, what do you do for cargo securement? Well, they go out and they show them, and then that, they have them practice, and that's that. Well, if you think about it, if I have to do something 7 plus or minus 2 times, and I would say this is dependent on prior experience. So it could be less if they have prior experience, but they've done it, tons and tons of times. So it's already in their long-term memory. But think about, I don't know, Tiger Woods. When Tiger Woods is golfing and it's automated, the information for him, it's become a natural behavior to hit a golf ball. He's hit so many, or Serena Williams, how many tennis balls or overheads, time, it's this repetition to be able to have information be encoded into your long-term memory indefinitely. So I say, cargo securement, cargo securement, cargo securement. How do I cargo secure? How do I cargo? How do I cargo? You say it, 9 times, and you present that information 9 times. Most of these things I see, they're done one time, and that's it, in one format, in one way, in one situation, in one setting. That's it. And then we expect that driver, if they're in a critical situation, or maybe the cargo, the strap doesn't fit exactly, or it doesn't work exactly the way they anticipated, they won't be able to recall that information from their long-term memory. So it's really important to understand how our brain mechanisms work from the working memory. We rehearse it so that it's encoded into your long-term memory. Your brain cannot take information in. Now, I will say, if your house is on fire and you have a life-changing event, that is a different way that information is coded into your neuron, in your psychological systems, that will allow that information to be recalled. That probably is so ingrained because of that situation that you will never forget that moment. That's a different process that happened. That's not the same process as training for an educational setting. So we're going to do it again. We're going to see if you remember more things this time, and I'm going to give you 8.5 seconds to see if you can recall that information. So the idea is that if you had an experience, like maybe you owned a Vizsla, maybe you played tennis, maybe that piggy in a blanket caught your eye because it was so strange, maybe those things you had prior experience with, that is a scaffold that you built on that information that allowed you to recall that information better than something you've never seen before, like that crying baby that was in the middle. That's kind of odd. You never saw that before, so you might not have been able to recall that as easier than the other things that you saw. This idea of using situational or familiar things, this is why authentic learning and building videos, if you're going to build a video, to have it be short and specific to your specific situation is critical for remembering that content. If you're watching something generic and long, you're not going to be able to recall that on a critical event situation unless you've had years and years and years and years experience doing that. So to test this theory about using things that you're familiar with, I do this activity where most of us have been to Las Vegas, and you've walked the strip of Las Vegas, and you try to recall what you've seen on the Las Vegas Strip. And I'll give you 8.5 seconds, and this is going to be a little bit easier than the one that you just did. So if I asked all of you, which characters did you see? You probably very easily were able to maybe do 5, at least 5, because you had prior knowledge with those things, like Tickle Me Elmo, when I'm sure a lot of people have seen that or have experienced with that, or Kiss, they've seen that band, or Darth Vader, Star Wars fans. Things that you have prior knowledge with is important to anchor that information on. So what happens if you have prior knowledge, your neuron and your scaffold and inside your brain, they say, hey, I've seen this before. So now I can process it and bring it and anchor it even more into my long-term memory, time and time again. So the one thing I like to point out, so a lot of times I see people doing stuff on no texting and driving. We all know not to text and drive. It's not that we can't recall that and we don't understand that we shouldn't text and drive. What's happening there is changing behaviors And that's a different motivational theory to work on to change the behavior so that you don't text and drive. That's a different than recalling information and understanding the information. They're different theories. So, like I said, if you understand the information, then you're going to be able to recall it better. And you're definitely going to have that information at a later time. So the more experiences that you have with something, you can recall it more easily when you need it. Think about this with anything in your life as an adult. The more you practice, the more you have exposure, the better you are going to be to do it. For cargo securement, the fact that they took them out and they had one time to do it and they did practice and practice and practice and practice and practice, and you say it 9 times, plus get information about it, see it in a different way, have something reinforce it later in a different situation. It's so important to do that. So there are strategies with encoding that can assist. Here are 3 main takeaways that are important to remember. First of all, there are limits to how much you can process. Already you're at cognitive overload on this presentation. You won't remember a lot of it. There are limits to cognitive processes. It's important that you have meaningful exposure, meaning authentic, meaningful, elaborate rehearsal of information so that you can recall it when you need it. And the third thing that it's very important is our brains process and scan information in a particular way. You have to break down content into meaningful pieces. That's why we do e-nuggets or micro lessons so that your brain can scan and process information quickly and take it into your processing ability. So what I'm going to do is I really quickly put together some letters and we're going to organize it in a way to help with your cognitive processing. So in 8.5 seconds, I want you to look in and see how many of these words you can remember in 8.5 seconds. And what I've done is I've taken the letters afterwards and put it in a meaningful chunk so that you would remember it. So I'm going to give you 8.5 seconds. Don't write the letters down. Just see if you can remember them. All right, here we go. All right, how many letters did you remember? Maybe 3, maybe 5, maybe 6. So if I were to put those letters in a meaningful way, then you would remember them. And so I'm going to show you that. This is so critical. And this is one of the things I'm really passionate. If you can't tell, there's so much generic content out there. It's not meaningful. It's going to give them information, but to make it meaningful, you have to make it authentic. It has to be put in a way that your brain can process it. And you have to give it repetitive exposure so that it goes into your long-term memory. Once it's in your long-term memory, yeah, sure. If you're not then performing that, then you have to change behaviors. It's a different motivational strategy. So here are the words in a way that's organized. Very easy, you can see what those words were. I put those words in a way, and this is what makes letters, words in sentences, is that we give them a meaningful representation so that you can process them. Truck drivers keep the world going. Critical to present information in a way that our brains can process. We may think that, okay, we're presenting the information, so they're processing it, but studying neurons and looking at how our brains work, if there isn't a meaningful connection there for the adult learner, they're not going to, number one, have their attention. They're not going to be open to learning it. And their brain is going to have a hard time remembering that information because there's no meaningful connection for them to anchor it to. So critical. So I like to awake the neurons in our brain. These are 4 simple tips that you can take away to really try to wake someone's neurons. The first one is always set the purpose, set the why, tell the adults why they're going to do that, why this is important for them to learn. Have them tell you why it's important to learn. When you involve the learners, and this is the third point, All of us are adults. We all come with prior knowledge and experiences and expertise. Involve them in their learning. I found in this industry, and very few times, adults are involved in their learning experience through the discussion. And when I ask and I try to seek why, it's because there's a fear that they're going to say something wrong. But isn't that really the opportunity to coach them and to be the coach and to guide them into what to do and to understand their thinking? Unless you know their why or you know what they're thinking, it's going to be difficult to then change their thinking and ground that into what is correct. So always involve the learners into the learning experience. You could go on our website, learnwithluma.com. I did a whole year blog of learner to learner ways of engaging learners. It's free. I'm passionate about it. There's so many strategies that you can do to involve learners in their own learning. Critical. The second one is activate prior knowledge. A good way to start this would have been to ask all of you, what do you know? What do you know about learning? Or what do you know about how we learn? Super to know where you're coming from to be able to activate what you already know, to ground it on what you don't know, to further your understanding. And then 4, providing opportunities for ownership and mentorship. It's important for the adult learner to own their learning experience. If they don't have buy-in and they don't have the why, the sense is their mind's going to drift and they're not going to be engaged. So giving them ownership to help others be involved in the learning is really critical and important for adult learners, and especially to give them purpose, to have their neurons stay awake during the duration of that critical education piece, because your brains start to wander. So what can be done? People ask me this question, so I wanted to end with this slide before we open it up to questions. And I touched on this a little bit because redundancy in terms of what we do in each of these stages, but what can be done to engage all employees? So it's not just the specific ones that you're trying to train, but everybody at the organization. So the first thing is everyone should be moving in the same direction and understanding not only what's in it for them, why should they do this? Why do they need to learn it? And how does it affect them? Why should they even want to learn it? Last year, I did a research study. I studied over 600,000 of our learners. And what I really discovered was that there are a lot of companies that assign training. However, they don't ask the learners what they want to learn. And in fact, what I saw is that there was a great discrepancy between what was being assigned and what the learners wanted to learn. The learners wanted to learn about topics like depression and how to be safe on the road and caring for an elderly parent, and these topics that we have in our system and that could be assigned, but that isn't critical for safety and compliance. So it's very important to couple training that they have to do. It's like, well, you have to do this. That's what's in it for you. You have to do it. Well, that's not motivating. I mean, it's not motivating to any adult. It's you. This is why we do it. But what do you want to learn? Well, that's going to be with this. So coupling that is very important. The second thing is recognizing, I hear people talk about learning styles. In fact, in the education and learning science, it's not really a learning style, it's more of a preference. Your brain isn't like pre-wired that you have to like have a different style. It's more of your brain is wired that you prefer learner choice to learn in a specific way. And so that way you can get somebody's attention. So understanding that learners have a different learning preference is very critical. And then the third one, again, is if you have everyone at your organization learning together, you build what we call learning community. And I have a research paper that I can share with you on building learning communities. So powerful when you have people learning together in the same way, in the same mission, not in the same way, but with the same mission. Everyone helping each other, you can create a really powerful engine that can help build education programs. And I've seen that, and it's quite powerful. I really appreciate your time today. And if I'm going to open it up for questions. I have a website, learningwithgina.com. I have a lot of free articles that you can access. And then, of course, if you have questions, you can always email me. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Gina. That was a really fascinating presentation, and it made me reflect on kind of how I learn. I think one of the most interesting points is that, it made me reflect and kind of look back and say, well, how do I like to learn? And kind of, and what would I have done? What would I have retained more of had I learned it differently, or been given the option to learn it differently? And I think it's a fascinating topic for this committee and for our industry, for the intermodal industry. Could you talk a little bit more about kind of how you when you are presenting a training program to an organization or to a team, how do I help folks identify what style or what are their preferred ways of learning? Like what's a technique? Because not everyone is self-aware of kind of how they like to learn. They just they don't really have a good sense of that.
Right. A great way of doing that is sending out a survey or doing it in person, whatever works best, a format works best at your organization. But ask somebody, what's something that you remember learning that was most impactful to you? And how was that taught? And so really understanding something that they already understand and knowing how that information was delivered in a way that really grounded them in really saying that was really an impactful way of learning. We all remember something, whether it was an adult or going through a traditional education, like maybe it was a project or some specific content topic that we remember and why it was important and why that really stuck with us. In my podcast, I always ask the question, was there something in your learning experience or career that really left an impact? Asking that question, what was that? That will really bring to light, because you're right, David, just asking the question, like, how do you learn? I mean, that's just such an open-ended question, but asking the question, what was an impactful way that you learned something and what did that mean to you, is a different question, but you get the same information.
And thank you. That's a great tip. I want to go back to another point that you made, which was talking about how engaging everyone, teaching everyone at the same time. Don't just kind of segregate the learning. Don't say that one person, this team needs to learn this, but this other team doesn't need to learn this. I mean, that's particularly relevant for the issue of safety, where everyone who is on a terminal or everyone who is in a facility, regardless of their role, has a responsibility to safety. And I think that could you talk a little bit about kind of how that empowers an organization if you approach it that way?
Yeah, I think having everyone, I've definitely seen this at organizations. We went over to TransX in Canada, and to just see at the individual employees' desks, taped on their desks, this commitment to safety and these learning elements, the learning badges at their desk, everyone kind of moving on the same page. It's this whole environment and culture that you're building to create the environment that, where everyone is committed to this safety and understanding, and we're all here to help each other move in the right direction. Because if not everyone is on the same page with that, then there's elements of, well, that, this group isn't committed in the same way. And so to walk through that organization, and I've seen this many times, and having everyone on that same page and have that same vision is imperative to the culture, the safety culture at an organization. And that means walking through the hallways or even outside, they had posters, they had commitment messages, they did newsletters, just so many different elements to bring this community together, and a lot of strategies. And that's a whole nother talk on how to do that. But it is quite powerful when that happens. And
I think the key there really too is that it's a reinforcement. It's kind of that underlying kind of that continuous education, but it's not the in-your-face formal training. It's kind of just it's part of the culture. It's part of what everyone kind of sees and does. And I think that's really where that demonstrates a successful program. I don't know if Bert or Jason have any questions or any comments they'd like to make.
I have a quick one, Gina. Just You mentioned at surveying, you find out that workforce population often responds with they're not teaching me things that I care about or that I want to know.
Mhm.
And I think you used I think health or
Mhm.
senior care for a parent, or maybe it's finances, right? So,
Mhm.
and the answer seems obvious once you said it, but I'm assuming addressing personal non-work issues also
Mhm.
impacts the work issues, right? If I show that I care
Yeah.
about you taking care of your parent,
Mhm.
you give me more at work. Is that kind of the
Absolutely. Absolutely. Being at the core of caring about us as humans, as adults, is critical. I mean, everyone at work is dealing with things that are not work related, but are impacting how you perform at work. And if we're not open to that idea and we're not looking at that, it could be critical because if we show them that we care about them, and it has to be authentic. It has to be. I mean, you truly have to care and you have to understand where they're coming from and where their mindset is at. If your mind is distracted and fixated on something, you had an argument with a spouse or you went to a customer and something happened and you want learning on how to make that so it doesn't happen in the future, is critical to their well-being and ultimately the safety at your organization. Absolutely, Bert. Thank you for bringing that up.
Well, I am not seeing any other questions. So I am going to say, Gina, thank you so very much for sharing your expertise with us today. We look forward to taking a look at your website, your resources, and we appreciate your time. And I'm just going to wrap up by saying, if you have, mark your calendars. I know it seems a far distance from now, but the business meeting will be May 6 to 8 of next year in Lombard, Illinois, and we'll be opening registration in January. If you have any questions or any suggestions, please don't hesitate to drop them to info@intermodal.org. And of course, don't forget to visit the website at intermodal.org. So on behalf of Ayanna and the Intermodal Safety Committee, I thank you all very much for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.